In the sultry heat of coastal Georgia during the summer of 1847, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like mourning veils, and the Ogeechee River carried secrets to the Atlantic, there unfolded an event that Savannah's aristocracy would spend generations trying to erase from memory. The Oakmont Estate, with its pristine white columns overlooking perfectly manicured rice fields, became the stage for what society columns delicately referred to as the Thornton family tragedy. On a single August evening, 13 members of Chatham County's wealthiest families collapsed during what should have been a joyous engagement celebration. Their deaths were not quick. They were methodical, agonizing, and deeply personal. What the investigators never understood, what the newspapers dared not print, was that every dish served that night had been prepared with absolute precision by hands that had lost everything worth living for. This is the account of Margaret Whitfield, a woman who transformed grief into patience, sorrow into strategy, and culinary artistry into the most exacting form of justice Savannah had ever witnessed. A woman who chose her own name on the day she decided that some sins are too monstrous to go unpunished. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Oakmont Estate commanded nearly 1,800 acres of prime lowland along the Ogeechee River, its endless rice fields shimmering like liquid gold under the relentless Georgia sun. This was not cotton country. This was rice empire territory, where fortunes rose and fell with the tides that flooded the carefully engineered field systems, and where the labor required was considered even more brutal than the cotton plantations of the interior. Augustus Caldwell had inherited Oakmont from his father in 1832 and had transformed it into one of the most profitable operations in the entire coastal region. His success was built on three foundations: ruthless efficiency in field management, strategic marriages into other wealthy families, and most importantly, a kitchen that had become legendary throughout Savannah's elite circles. The main house at Oakmont was a masterpiece of Greek Revival architecture, designed by a Charleston architect who had studied the great estates of the Carolina coast. 4 massive columns supported a second-story veranda that wrapped around the entire structure, offering views of the river on one side and the geometrically perfect rice fields on the other. Inside, crystal chandeliers imported from France caught the afternoon light and scattered it across hand-painted wallpaper depicting pastoral European scenes that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the world that existed beyond the estate's boundaries. Penelope Caldwell presided over this domain with the nervous energy of a woman who understood that her entire social standing rested on maintaining appearances. She spent her mornings coordinating with household staff, her afternoons receiving visits from other plantation wives, and her evenings hosting dinners that were discussed in Savannah parlors for weeks afterward. The true secret of the Caldwell reputation, however, resided in a building separate from the main house. The summer kitchen stood about 50 yards from the manor, a deliberate distance that kept cooking heat and smells away from the family during the sweltering months. This structure, with its massive brick hearths, copper pots hanging from ceiling beams, and walls lined with herbs drying in fragrant bundles, was Margaret's kingdom. She commanded this space with the quiet authority of someone who understood that her skills made her simultaneously invaluable and invisible. The White families who praised the Caldwell table never once asked to meet the woman whose hands created the dishes they savored. They didn't need to know her name, they only needed to taste her work. Margaret had arrived at Oakmont in 1831 as a girl of 10, purchased from a bankrupt estate in Charleston, along with her mother and 2 younger siblings. The Caldwell overseer had been instructed to acquire field workers, but when Augustus Caldwell's mother, the formidable matriarch Eleanor Caldwell, had observed Margaret's mother preparing a simple meal during the inspection, she had insisted the family be assigned to household duties instead. It was one of those random moments of chance that would shape the trajectory of multiple lives. Margaret's mother became a house servant, and Margaret herself was placed under the supervision of Aunt Josephine, the elderly woman who had ruled the Oakmont kitchen for nearly 40 years. Aunt Josephine was a woman of uncertain age and undeniable presence. Born somewhere in the Caribbean, she had been brought to Georgia as a young woman and had absorbed culinary traditions from 3 continents. She knew French techniques from New Orleans trained cooks who had passed through Savannah, African preparations passed down through generations of enslaved women, and the indigenous wisdom of coastal tribes about which plants could nourish and which could harm. More remarkably, she could read and write, skills she had acquired through a complicated history she never fully explained but which involved a former owner who had been a professor of literature and apparently possessed some misguided notions about education. Aunt Josephine recognized in young Margaret the same gift she herself possessed, an almost supernatural ability to understand flavors, to sense which combinations would elevate a dish and which would destroy it. She also recognized something equally important. Margaret had the memory and discipline required to master not just cooking, but the deeper knowledge that came with understanding exactly what each ingredient could do to the human body. For 12 years Margaret learned everything Aunt Josephine could teach. She learned which mushrooms growing in the shaded areas near the rice fields could add earthy depth to a sauce and which would cause vivid hallucinations. She learned how to preserve seafood brought up from the coast, how to transform the endless bounty of the river and ocean into dishes that made wealthy men close their eyes in pleasure. She learned the science of fermentation, watching patiently as cucumbers transformed into pickles, as cabbage became sauerkraut, as grape juice became vinegar with such high acidity it could strip paint from wood if left undiluted. She learned about tides and seasons, about how the phase of the moon affected when certain plants should be harvested for maximum potency. And she learned to read and write, practicing letters and flowers spread on the kitchen table during the quiet hours before dawn, copying recipes from Penelope Caldwell's collection of cookbooks that had been passed down through 3 generations of wealthy Southern wives. Aunt Josephine's lessons went beyond the practical. She taught Margaret about patience, about how some knowledge must be kept hidden, about how power takes many forms and often resides in unexpected places. She would say, while they cleaned fish brought up from the coast, that the world might see them as property, but knowledge could never be owned by anyone except the person who held it in their mind. She taught Margaret that a woman who controlled what went into the bodies of powerful men possessed a kind of power those men could never fully understand, even as they depended on it daily. These lessons were delivered quietly, almost casually, as they worked side by side preparing elaborate meals for people who would never learn their names. But Margaret absorbed every word, storing them away like precious seeds that would one day find fertile ground. When Margaret was 17 she married Isaiah, a skilled craftsman who worked in the carriage house and forge at Oakmont. Isaiah was 5 years older, a man of quiet strength and remarkable skill with metal and wood. Augustus Caldwell valued him highly because Isaiah could repair anything from a broken wheel to a damaged piece of silver, making him far too valuable to sell or risk losing. Their marriage was one of the rare ones that came with Caldwell's explicit blessing, not out of any sentimental regard for their happiness, but because both were considered essential workers whose contentment contributed to the estate's smooth operation. They were allowed to live together in a cabin slightly larger than the standard quarters, and when their children came, this was seen as a bonus. More property, more future workers, more economic value for the Caldwell holdings. Grace was born in 1838, arriving in the early morning hours with Aunt Josephine serving as midwife. Benjamin followed in 1840, a serious baby who rarely cried and seemed to observe the world with ancient eyes. Ruth came in 1842, the smallest and most spirited of the 3, with a laugh that could brighten even the darkest days. Margaret loved her children with an intensity that sometimes frightened her because she understood the fundamental fragility of a slave mother's love. Her children were not truly hers. They belonged to Augustus Caldwell, and at any moment, for any reason or for no reason at all, they could be sold away from her. This knowledge lived in her chest like a physical.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Weight, something she carried every moment of every day. But she also allowed herself moments of hope, dangerous as that hope might be. Her skills made her indispensable, and by extension her family was protected. As long as the Caldwell reputation depended on the Oakmont kitchen, Margaret believed her children were safe. The social world of Savannah's planter class revolved around intricate networks of family connections, business partnerships, and carefully arranged marriages. The Caldwell family occupied a respectable position in this hierarchy, wealthy enough to command respect, but not so established as the oldest Rice dynasties. Penelope Caldwell understood that her family's continued ascent required strategic alliances, which was why she had cultivated a friendship with Constance Thornton, matriarch of one of the most powerful families in the region. The Thorntons controlled 3 plantations totaling over 5,000 acres, owned a profitable import business in Savannah's Port District, and wielded considerable political influence throughout Georgia. When Penelope's daughter Vivian caught the attention of Edmund Thornton, the family's eldest son, it was seen as a social triumph of the highest order. Edmund Thornton was 24 years old in the spring of 1847, a tall man with dark hair and the kind of aristocratic features that made older women sigh, and younger women lower their eyes demurely when he passed. He had been educated at the College of Charleston, and had spent a year touring Europe, returning with affected mannerisms and a collection of opinions about art and philosophy that he deployed in conversation like weapons designed to demonstrate his superiority. He was considered an excellent match, the kind of husband who would elevate the Caldwell family's standing for generations. What the polite society of Savannah chose not to discuss too openly was Edmund's reputation for cruelty, his habit of finding entertainment in the suffering of those who could not defend themselves, and the rumors that followed him from his family's plantations about disappeared slaves and unexplained deaths. Margaret had observed Edmund during his courtship visits to Oakmont, watching from the kitchen as he and Vivian strolled through the gardens, as he charmed Augustus and Penelope with his practiced sophistication. She had noticed how his expression changed when he thought no one of importance was watching, how his eyes followed the younger house servants, how he spoke to slaves with a casual contempt that went beyond the normal dynamics of the system. She had felt a cold warning settle in her stomach, an instinct that something about this man was fundamentally wrong in ways that transcended even the normalized brutality of their world. But she was a cook, a slave, a woman with no voice in the decisions of wealthy white families. Her concerns, even if she had dared to voice them, would have meant nothing. The engagement was announced in March of 1847 with great fanfare. There would be a formal celebration at Oakmont in August, a garden party that would bring together both families and their closest associates. It would be an opportunity for the Caldwells to demonstrate their hospitality, and for Margaret to prove once again why the Oakmont kitchen was celebrated throughout the region. Penelope Caldwell began planning immediately, consulting with Margaret almost daily about menus, about how to showcase local ingredients, about creating dishes that would impress the notoriously demanding Constance Thornton. Margaret accepted these consultations with her usual quiet competence, already beginning to envision the elaborate feast she would create. She had no way of knowing that this engagement party would never take place as planned, that between March and August, her entire world would be destroyed, and that the celebration she was planning would indeed become memorable, but for reasons that would haunt Savannah for generations. Spring arrived in coastal Georgia with deceptive gentleness, painting the landscape in soft greens and filling the air with the perfume of blooming magnolias and jasmine. The rice fields had been flooded according to the precise schedule that governed the cultivation cycle, transforming the landscape into a patchwork of reflecting pools that mirrored the sky. It was Margaret's favorite time of year when the winter cold released its grip, and the brutal summer heat had not yet descended, when fresh vegetables began appearing in the garden, and the children could play outside without the extreme discomfort of either season. Grace had turned 9 that spring, already showing signs of the woman she would become, serious and thoughtful like her father, but with her mother's gift for understanding how things worked. Benjamin at 7 was quieter than most boys his age, preferring to watch and listen rather than engage in the rough play of other children in the quarters. Ruth at 5 was pure joy, a child who found wonder in everything from butterflies to the way sunlight moved across water. The morning of April 15th began like any other. Margaret rose before dawn, as she had done for so many years that her body no longer needed the church bells from distant Savannah to wake her. She dressed quietly so as not to disturb Isaiah, who had worked late the previous night repairing a broken axle on one of the work wagons. The children were still deeply asleep on their shared pallet, tangled together like puppies. She paused for a moment to look at them, feeling that familiar mixture of overwhelming love and persistent fear that characterized every slave mother's experience. Then she stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness and made her way toward the summer kitchen, where Patience would already have the fires going and water heating in the massive iron kettles. The Caldwell household was preparing for a visit from Constance Thornton and her daughter Beatrice. They would arrive mid-morning to discuss final details for the August engagement celebration, and Penelope had insisted that lunch must be extraordinary. Margaret had planned a menu designed to showcase the spring harvest from the Oakmont gardens, to demonstrate the kind of quality and creativity that would characterize the larger event. She would prepare a chilled soup made from the first tender peas of the season, pan-fried river fish with a sauce of fresh herbs and lemon brought up from the coast, roasted spring chicken with new potatoes, and for dessert, a delicate cake layered with strawberry preserves she had made the previous week. It was the kind of meal that required absolute concentration and perfect timing, the kind of challenge Margaret actually enjoyed despite the context of servitude within which her skills were trapped. By 8 in the morning, the kitchen was a controlled storm of activity. Patience had finished the cake layers and was preparing the buttercream that would hold them together. Dinah had returned from the river with fresh fish, already cleaned and ready for cooking. Esther, the youngest assistant at just 14, was carefully washing lettuce and herbs from the garden, her movements still uncertain but improving under Margaret's patient instruction. Margaret herself was preparing the soup, a process that required cooking the peas just long enough to soften them, but not so long that they lost their brilliant green color. She had taught Aunt Josephine's method to her assistants, the technique of shocking the cooked vegetables in cold water to preserve their color before pureeing them into a silky consistency that would impress even the most critical palate. The children appeared around mid-morning, as they often did when Margaret's work kept her at the kitchen rather than in the quarters. Grace carried Ruth on her hip, and Benjamin walked beside them carrying a small basket of eggs they had collected from the chicken coops near the slave cabins. Margaret gave them cold biscuits left from the family's breakfast and reminded them to stay where she could see them. There was a small courtyard behind the summer kitchen where the children often played, close enough for supervision but far enough to stay out of the way of the serious work happening inside. Grace, responsible beyond her years, assured her mother that she would watch the younger ones, that they would stay in sight, that they would be careful. Margaret smiled at her eldest daughter and returned to her work, secure in the knowledge that Grace could be trusted to keep her siblings safe. The Thornton carriage arrived precisely at 11, drawn by a matched pair of chestnuts that spoke to the family's wealth and attention to status symbols. Constance Thornton descended with the assistance of a liveried footman, her dove-gray dress and elaborate bonnet the picture of refined taste. Beatrice followed, 17 years old and already displaying the haughty bearing of someone raised to believe her birth made her superior to most of humanity. They were greeted by Penelope Caldwell with the elaborate courtesy that characterized interactions among the planter class, a performance of manners that masked the constant competition for social position. The women retired to the front parlor to discuss wedding plans, leaving instructions that they should be notified when lunch was ready to serve. Margaret was putting the final touches on the fish when she realized she hadn't seen the children for perhaps 20 minutes. This was not unusual in itself. They were good children who understood the boundaries they were expected to observe. But something made her step to the kitchen door and scan the courtyard. Empty. She walked around the building, expecting to find them playing on the other side, perhaps having wandered slightly farther than permitted but still within reasonable distance. They were not there. A cold finger of unease traced down her spine. She called their names, keeping her voice controlled because showing fear as a slave, even over missing children, could be interpreted as disruption or insubordination. Silence answered her. Patience noticed Margaret's distraction and came to the doorway, asking if something was wrong. Margaret explained that the children seemed to have wandered off, probably down toward the quarters, nothing serious but she needed to fetch them. Patience assured her that she could manage the final preparations, that Margaret should go find her children. Margaret removed her apron, folded it with automatic precision despite her growing anxiety, and walked quickly toward the slave quarters. Along the way, she asked everyone she encountered if they had seen 3 children, describing them, even though nearly everyone at Oakmont knew Grace, Benjamin, and Ruth by sight. No one had seen them. An older woman named Tabitha mentioned that she thought she had heard children's voices coming from the direction of the rice fields perhaps an hour earlier, but she couldn't be certain. The rice fields. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. The fields were flooded now, the water kept at carefully controlled depths by an elaborate system of trunks and gates that regulated flow from the river. Children were strictly forbidden from playing near the fields during flooding season. The water was deeper than it appeared, the mud beneath treacherous, and every year there were stories from other plantations of children who had drowned in rice fields, their bodies sometimes not found for
days. Margaret broke into a run, no longer caring how it might look, no longer concerned with the rules about maintaining composure. She ran toward the nearest rice field, calling her children's names with increasing desperation. She saw the overturned basket first, the one Benjamin had been carrying that morning. It lay at the edge of the field where the dry ground gave way to shallow water. Then she saw the footprints, small feet that had walked to the water's edge. And in the water itself, partially hidden by the young rice plants, she saw a flash of faded blue fabric. The dress Ruth had been wearing. Margaret plunged into the water without hesitation, without thought, driven by pure maternal instinct. The water was deeper than she expected, rising to her waist within 3 steps. The mud sucked at her feet, trying to pull her down. She pushed forward, reaching the place where she had seen the blue fabric, and her hands found small limbs, cold and still. She pulled Ruth from the water, the child's body limp and unresponsive, her lips already taking on a bluish tint. Margaret screamed then, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere outside her own body, and began carrying her daughter toward dry land. Other slaves heard her screams and came running. 2 men plunged into the water, searching, and within minutes they found Benjamin and Grace, both submerged, both completely still. The men brought the children to the embankment where Margaret had laid Ruth on the ground. She was trying to press water from Ruth's lungs, attempting every technique Aunt Josephine had taught her about reviving someone who had nearly drowned, breathing into her daughter's mouth, pushing on her small chest, begging and praying and commanding Ruth to breathe. Isaiah arrived, having heard the commotion from the carriage house. He dropped to his knees beside Benjamin, trying the same desperate measures Margaret was attempting, while others worked on Grace. For long minutes the only sounds were the gasping efforts of adults trying to force life back into small bodies, and the quiet sobbing of those who stood watching, knowing it was already too late, but unable to voice that knowledge. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably less than 10 minutes, Isaiah gently placed his hand over Margaret's, stopping her frantic efforts. He said nothing, but his eyes told her what she already knew in her heart. They were gone, all 3 of them. Grace, Benjamin, and Ruth had drowned in the rice fields, and no amount of desperate effort could bring them back. Augustus Caldwell arrived at the scene shortly after, followed by the overseer Dalton Krebs. Caldwell's face was tight with anger, not grief. 3 valuable assets had been lost, and someone would be held accountable. His first question was what the children had been doing near the flooded fields, his tone making clear that he considered this primarily a failure of supervision. Krebs began questioning the assembled slaves, demanding to know who had seen the children, who had been responsible for watching them, whose negligence had led to this loss of property. Margaret knelt in the mud beside her children's bodies, beyond caring what Caldwell thought, beyond fear of punishment, beyond everything except the vast emptiness that had opened inside her chest. Isaiah stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his own face a mask of contained anguish. It was during this interrogation that a young house servant named Thomas, perhaps 10 years old, spoke up with the terrified hesitation of someone who knows that telling the truth might bring punishment, but that remaining silent feels worse. He said he had seen the children that morning, that they had been playing in the courtyard behind the kitchen as they were supposed to. He had also seen Edmund Thornton, who had accompanied his mother and sister to the visit. Edmund had called the children over, had spoken to them for several minutes. Thomas couldn't hear what was said, but he saw Edmund pointing toward the rice fields, saw him hand something to Grace, saw the children walk away in that direction. Then Edmund had returned to the main house, going in through a side entrance rather than the front. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Augustus Caldwell's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, calculation, and finally a kind of careful blankness. Krebs immediately began berating Thomas, calling him a liar, threatening severe punishment for making accusations against a white man, against a member of the Thornton family no less. But Thomas stood his ground with the courage of childhood innocence, insisting that he had seen what he had seen, that he was telling the truth. Margaret looked up at Augustus Caldwell, meeting his eyes directly in a way she never had before, in a way that violated every rule of the social order they existed within. She saw the truth in his face. He believed Thomas, he knew what Edmund Thornton was capable of, and he was going to do absolutely nothing about it. Caldwell ordered Krebs to take Thomas away, and ensure he understood the consequences of spreading lies about respected families. He then turned to Margaret and Isaiah, his voice taking on a tone of false sympathy that was somehow worse than open anger. He expressed his condolences for their loss, noted that it was a terrible accident, and assured them that the children would receive a proper burial in the slave cemetery. He added that Margaret should take the rest of the day to compose herself, but he expected her back at work tomorrow morning. The engagement luncheon had been delayed due to the disturbance, and Constance Thornton would expect the meal to be served shortly. The elaborate food Margaret had prepared with such care was still waiting in the summer kitchen. Life, as they said, must go on. Margaret understood in that moment several fundamental truths that she had previously allowed herself to deny. Her children's lives had meant nothing to Augustus Caldwell beyond their potential future economic value. The truth about how they died would be suppressed, because maintaining good relations with the Thornton family was infinitely more important than seeking justice for 3 dead slave children. Edmund Thornton would face no consequences, no questions, no accountability whatsoever for what he had done, and she, Margaret, was expected to simply endure this loss, to continue cooking elaborate meals for the people who had killed her children, to serve and smile and pretend that her heart had not been ripped from her chest and thrown into the mud of a rice field. The burial took place that evening in the slave cemetery, a small plot of land at the far edge of the Oakmont property, where generations of enslaved people had been laid to rest without markers or monuments. A few words were said by Uncle Moses, an elderly man who served as the informal preacher for the slave community. Isaiah helped dig the graves himself, refusing to let anyone else do this final service for his children. Margaret stood beside him, dry-eyed and silent. She had cried herself empty during the afternoon. Now there was only a vast numbness punctuated by moments of such intense rage that she felt it might consume her entirely if she gave it any room to breathe. As the last shovel of earth was placed over the small graves, as the community began to drift away, Margaret remained standing there in the gathering darkness. She stood there for hours, Isaiah eventually returning to their cabin alone, understanding that his wife needed something from this vigil that he could not provide. When Margaret finally returned to their cabin, well after midnight, she did not speak. She removed her mud-stained dress, washed herself with cold water from the basin, and lay down on the pallet that suddenly seemed far too large without three small bodies crowded against them. Isaiah reached for her hand in the darkness, and she let him hold it, but she could not bring herself to respond to his touch with any warmth. Something fundamental had broken inside her, and she did not know if it could be repaired, or if she even wanted it to be. That night she made no sound, but in her mind she began planning. Not consciously yet, not with any clear intent, but somewhere deep in her being, the woman who had been born Margaret, and had lived for 26 years trying to protect her family within an impossible system, began her transformation into someone else entirely. The next morning, Margaret returned to the summer kitchen as ordered. Penelope Caldwell expressed brief perfunctory condolences, and immediately began discussing the rescheduled luncheon for Constance Thornton. The meal must be perfect, she emphasized, because yesterday's unfortunate interruption had already created an awkward situation. Margaret listened with a face that betrayed nothing, nodded at appropriate moments, and began her work. Patience tried to offer comfort, but Margaret gently rebuffed her, saying she preferred to keep busy. Over the following days and weeks, everyone at Oakmont noticed that Margaret had become even quieter than before, more withdrawn, but none of them understood the true nature of the change taking place within her. She was not simply grieving, she was being reborn as something her former self could never have imagined becoming. The days following the burial existed in Margaret's memory as a gray blur, time moving in strange rhythms that seemed to bear no relation to the actual passage of hours. She performed her duties in the summer kitchen with mechanical precision, her hands moving through familiar tasks, while her mind existed somewhere else entirely. Patience and Dinah exchanged worried glances, but said nothing directly, understanding that grief this profound could not be addressed with words or gestures of comfort. Esther, younger and less experienced with the brutal realities of their world, sometimes looked at Margaret with tears in her own eyes, mourning not just the children she had occasionally played with, but also the loss of some essential spark in the woman who had been teaching her the art of cooking. Isaiah tried to reach his wife in the evenings when they lay together in their cabin, the space made unbearably large by the absence of three small bodies that would never again crowd between them for warmth and comfort. He would take her hand, stroke her hair, speak softly about the memories they still possessed, about the brief years they had been blessed to love: Grace, Benjamin and Ruth. Margaret listened without responding, her eyes fixed on the rough wooden ceiling, her body present but her spirit somewhere far beyond his reach. She could not explain to him what was happening inside her, because she did not fully understand it herself. The grief was there, certainly, a vast ocean of sorrow that threatened to drown her if she allowed herself to fully feel its depth. But alongside the grief, something else was growing, something cold and hard and patient. On the fifth night after the burial, Margaret rose from the pallet, while Isaiah slept and walked out into the darkness. She did not head toward the rice fields where her children had died, though she had visited that spot each day, standing at the edge of the water and staring at nothing. Instead, she walked in the opposite direction, toward the edges of the Oakmont property, where cultivated land gave way to wild growth, where the careful geometry of the plantation dissolved into the organic chaos of coastal Georgia wilderness. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by, and Margaret moved with unconscious certainty toward a destination she had not consciously chosen. She found herself at a place Aunt Josephine had brought her years ago, back when the old woman was still teaching Margaret the deeper secrets of her craft. It was a small grove of live oak trees, so ancient their branches had grown into twisted shapes that seemed to defy natural law, reaching toward the earth before curving back skyward, draped in curtains of Spanish moss that moved in the night breeze like ghostly hair. Beneath these trees grew plants that thrived in deep shade, and the peculiar soil chemistry created by decades of fallen oak leaves. Margaret knelt in the darkness, and began to identify the growth around her by touch and scent, her fingers moving over leaves and stems with the practiced sensitivity of someone who had spent years learning to recognize plants in all conditions. Here was foxglove, its leaves containing compounds that could strengthen a failing heart, or stop a healthy one depending on dosage and preparation. There was nightshade, its dark berries holding concentrated toxins that could cause delirium and respiratory failure. She found jimsonweed, with its trumpet-shaped flowers closed against the night, pokeweed with its thick roots that could purge the body of everything it contained, and mushrooms growing on a fallen log that Aunt Josephine had warned her about with particular emphasis. The old woman had shown Margaret these plants not to encourage their use, but to ensure she could identify and avoid them, to protect the Caldwell family from accidental poisoning that might come from foraging in the wrong places. But Josephine had also taught her about dosages, about preparation methods, about how different compounds affected the human body in predictable ways. Margaret did not gather anything that night. She simply sat among the dangerous plants and felt something settle inside her, a kind of cold clarity that cut through the fog of grief that had surrounded her since the drowning. She understood with sudden absolute certainty that she could not continue living as she had been, serving the people who had murdered her children, and would face no earthly consequences for that murder. She could not smile and bow and cook elaborate meals for families who considered her less than human, who valued her children's lives at less than the cost of social embarrassment. But she also understood that she could not simply flee, could not run north, and hope to find freedom while leaving this injustice unanswered. Justice delayed might be justice denied, but justice carefully planned and patiently executed could be absolute. The transformation that began in Margaret during those weeks was both internal and external. Internally, she felt as though the woman she had been was dying, making room for someone harder, colder, more dangerous. The part of her that had believed in small happinesses, in protecting what she loved within the narrow boundaries permitted to her, in accepting the fundamental injustice of her world as an unchangeable reality, that part was withering away like a plant denied water. In its place grew something that had no name, something that combined her grief with her knowledge, her love for her lost children, with her understanding of exactly how fragile the human body could be when subjected to the right combination of natural compounds. Externally, the changes were more subtle but no less significant. Margaret began keeping a journal, writing in it late at night by the dim light of a candle made from saved kitchen scraps. She had always been able to read and write thanks to Aunt Josephine's teaching, but she had used these skills primarily for copying recipes, and reading the cooking manuals that Penelope Caldwell sometimes consulted. Now she wrote other things. She wrote memories of her children, preserving every detail she could recall about their personalities, their habits, the sound of their laughter. She wrote about the plants she had found in the oak grove, describing their properties with clinical precision. And she wrote about the people who had taken everything from her, cataloging their sins with the methodical attention of someone building a case for prosecution. She also began to change her name, at least in her own mind. Margaret had been the name given to her by the Charleston family who had originally owned her mother, a name chosen without thought or meaning beyond identifying property. She decided she would choose her own surname, as free people did, claiming an identity that was hers alone. She considered many options during those sleepless nights, testing different names in her mind, writing them in her journal to see how they looked on paper. She finally settled on Whitfield, taking the name from a signpost she had seen on one of the rare trips into Savannah, liking the way it sounded both respectable and ordinary, a name that suggested open spaces and freedom. In her journal, she began signing her entries as Margaret Whitfield, practicing the signature until it flowed naturally from her pen. Isaiah noticed these changes even if he could not fully understand them. His wife had become someone he barely recognized, present in body but absent in spirit, moving through her days with an efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. When he tried to talk to her about the future, about perhaps asking Augustus Caldwell's permission to try for more children eventually, she looked at him with eyes so cold he actually stepped back. She told him there would be no more children, not here, not under these circumstances, not ever. Her tone left no room for discussion. Isaiah, confused and grieving in his own way, withdrew into his work at the forge, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of hammer on metal, the predictable transformation of raw iron into useful objects. The summer of 1847 advanced with the relentless heat that characterized coastal Georgia, the air becoming so thick with humidity that breathing felt like drowning on dry land. The rice plants grew tall in the flooded fields, their green shoots eventually giving way to golden heads heavy with grain. The engagement celebration for Vivian Caldwell and Edmund Thornton had been rescheduled for August, the delay attributed to a minor illness in the Thornton family, though everyone understood it was really about allowing enough time to pass after the unfortunate incident with the drowned children. Penelope Caldwell resumed her consultations with Margaret about the menu, apparently believing that enough weeks had passed for the cook to have put her grief aside and returned to normal functioning. Margaret listened to Penelope's instructions with appropriate deference, nodding at suggestions, offering her own ideas when prompted, giving every appearance of being the same skilled and reliable cook she had always been. Inside, however, she was making very different plans. She knew that Edmund Thornton would attend the engagement celebration, along with his entire family and various other members of Savannah's elite society. She knew the event would feature an elaborate feast, multiple courses served over several hours, the kind of meal that would showcase her abilities and cement the Caldwell family's reputation for gracious hospitality. And she knew with absolute certainty that this celebration would be Edmund Thornton's last meal. The decision to proceed with revenge rather than escape or simple survival did not come easily. Despite Margaret's growing coldness, she spent long hours wrestling with the morality of what she was planning, questioning whether taking lives, even guilty lives, would make her as monstrous as those she sought to punish. She thought about her children, about what they would want, about whether they would recognize their mother in the woman she was becoming. But every time she approached doubt, she would remember Grace's serious eyes, Benjamin's quiet observations, Ruth's infectious laughter. She would remember their small cold bodies pulled from the rice field water. She would remember Augustus Caldwell's calculating decision to protect Edmund Thornton, rather than seek justice for murdered children, and her resolve would harden again, cold and unshakable. Margaret began making nocturnal expeditions to gather the plants she would need, moving through the darkness with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning the landscape around Oakmont. She collected foxglove leaves during the phase of the moon, when their potency was highest, carefully drying them in a hidden corner of the summer kitchen, where the other cooks never ventured. She harvested nightshade berries at their peak ripeness, storing them in a small jar she kept buried beneath the floor of her cabin. She gathered mushrooms that grew only on specific types of rotting wood, roots that required careful preparation to concentrate their active compounds, seeds that could cause effects ranging from vivid hallucinations to complete paralysis depending on dosage. But Margaret was not simply collecting poisons at random. She was planning with the precision of a military strategist, thinking through every detail of how the
engagement celebration would unfold. Who would be present, what dishes would be served to whom, how to ensure that her justice was both complete and discriminating. She had no intention of harming innocents. Children would be protected, servants would be spared, and even among the guilty, each would receive a sentence proportionate to their crimes. Edmund Thornton would die, that was certain, but his death would be slower and more agonizing than the others, a reflection of his particular guilt in murdering 3 innocent children for his own cruel amusement. During this period of planning and preparation, Margaret also began to experiment with small doses of her collected compounds, testing them in ways that would not be detected or attributed to deliberate poisoning. She added minute quantities to dishes served to the Caldwell family, amounts too small to cause serious harm, but sufficient to produce minor symptoms: slight nausea, headaches, fatigue, digestive discomfort. She observed the results with clinical detachment, noting how different people responded to different compounds, how long symptoms took to manifest, how the effects varied based on the person's size, age, and overall health. This information would be crucial when she finalized her plans for the engagement celebration. Augustus Caldwell began complaining of recurring stomach problems during this time, attributing them to the heat or perhaps something disagreeable in the well water. Penelope developed mysterious headaches that came and went without apparent cause, sometimes leaving her bedridden for hours. Even young Harrison, The Caldwell's 16-year-old son occasionally felt waves of dizziness that had no obvious explanation. None of them suspected Margaret. Why would they? She was the cook who had served them faithfully for years, a slave whose entire existence depended on their continued health and satisfaction. The possibility that she might be deliberately harming them was so far outside their conception of how their world worked that it literally never occurred to them. Margaret's assistants noticed some changes in her methods, but attributed them to grief-driven perfectionism rather than anything sinister. Patients observed that Margaret had become even more insistent on personally handling certain aspects of meal preparation, particularly the final seasoning and sauce work that had always been her specialty. Dinah noticed that Margaret had begun keeping some ingredients in a locked cabinet, claiming they were expensive items that needed protection from theft or waste. Esther, still young and inexperienced, simply tried to stay out of Margaret's way when the head cook seemed lost in thought, staring at her array of spices and dried herbs with an expression that made the girl vaguely uneasy without understanding why. The relationship between Margaret and Isaiah deteriorated further as the weeks passed. He could feel his wife slipping away from him, transforming into someone he no longer recognized, but he had no framework for understanding what was happening or how to stop it. When he tried to talk to her about his concerns, suggesting gently that perhaps she should speak to Uncle Moses or one of the older women in the quarters who had experienced similar losses, she looked at him with such contempt that he fell silent mid-sentence. She told him that talking would change nothing, that prayer would bring no comfort, that the only thing that mattered was ensuring that their children's deaths meant something, though she did not elaborate on what that cryptic statement meant. Isaiah began to fear his wife was losing her mind to grief, spiraling into a darkness from which she might never return. He considered speaking to Augustus Caldwell, asking if Margaret might be given some time away from her duties to recover, but he knew such a request would likely be denied and might even result in punishment for suggesting that a slave's emotional state should take precedence over the smooth operation of the household. So he remained silent, watching helplessly as Margaret became more distant, more cold, more focused on something he could not see or understand. He had lost his children to Edmund Thornton's cruelty and Augustus Caldwell's complicity. Now he was losing his wife to whatever transformation grief had wrought in her soul. By late July, Margaret had completed her preparations. She had gathered and processed all the compounds she would need, storing them in carefully labeled containers hidden in places only she knew about. She had finalized her menu for the engagement celebration, selecting dishes that would allow her to deliver her justice with precision and artistry. She had created detailed notes about dosages, timing, and expected effects, information she kept in her journal using a simple code that would be meaningless to anyone who might accidentally discover it. She had tested her theories through months of careful experimentation and observation. She was ready. On the last night of July, Margaret sat in her cabin writing in her journal by candlelight, while Isaiah slept restlessly on the pallet. She wrote a final entry before the engagement celebration, a kind of manifesto explaining her actions to herself, if not to any future reader. She wrote that she understood some would call what she planned murder, that others might see it as justified revenge, that the truth probably lay somewhere between those extremes. She wrote that she was not doing this because she expected it to change the system that had stolen and destroyed her children, but because some injustices were too profound to go unanswered. She wrote that she chose the name Whitfield because she wanted to die, if it came to that, as a person who had claimed her own identity rather than accepting the one forced upon her. She wrote that she loved her children more than her own life, and that this love required her to ensure their deaths meant something more than a minor inconvenience to wealthy families who barely noticed their existence. Finally, she wrote a message to Isaiah, knowing he might never read it, but needing to say the words nonetheless. She wrote that she was sorry for becoming someone he no longer recognized, that grief had transformed her in ways she could not prevent nor fully explain. She wrote that he hoped he would understand, eventually, that what she was about to do was not madness, but rather the sanest response possible to an insane world. She wrote that she loved him, that she always would, but that the woman he had married no longer existed. That woman had drowned in a rice field along with her children, and what remained was Margaret Whitfield, a name and identity chosen freely, a woman who would demonstrate that even the powerless could demand accountability from those who believed themselves untouchable.
The journal. Then she blew out the candle and lay down beside her sleeping husband, staring into the darkness. In 2 weeks, Vivian Caldwell and Edmund Thornton would celebrate their engagement with an elaborate feast attended by both families and their closest associates. The event would be remembered in Savannah for generations, though not for the reasons the Caldwells and Thorntons anticipated. Margaret closed her eyes and began to mentally review her plans one final time, checking every detail, ensuring nothing had been overlooked. She felt no excitement, no fear, no doubt. She felt only the cold certainty of purpose, the absolute clarity that comes when a person has surrendered everything except the need for justice. The woman who had been property, who had tried to protect her family within the brutal confines permitted to her, who had believed its skill and usefulness could provide security in a fundamentally unjust world. That woman was gone. What remained was judgment incarnate, and judgment would be served on the finest china Oakmont possessed. The August morning arrived with oppressive heat that seemed to press down on Oakmont Estate like a physical weight. Margaret woke before dawn, as always, her body moving through the familiar motions of dressing and preparing for the day, while her mind remained focused on the intricate calculations she had been refining for weeks. Today marked the beginning of the final preparations for the engagement celebration, scheduled for August 14th. Penelope Caldwell had insisted on a garden party that would showcase both the Oakmont grounds and Margaret's culinary abilities, an event that would position the Caldwell family as worthy partners to the powerful Thorntons. Margaret had spent the previous evening reviewing her detailed plans one final time, checking her hidden stores of prepared compounds, mentally rehearsing the sequence of actions she would need to execute with absolute precision. The celebration would begin at 4 in the afternoon, allowing guests to enjoy the gardens during the cooler late afternoon hours before sitting down to dinner as the sun set. This timing worked perfectly for Margaret's purposes, giving her the entire day to prepare while ensuring that symptoms would begin manifesting during the meal itself, when all targets would be gathered in one location with limited ability to seek immediate help. The guest lists had been finalized weeks earlier, and Margaret had memorized every name, every face, every detail she could gather about the 13 people who would attend. Edmund Thornton would be there, of course, along with his parents, Preston and Constance, his brothers, Victor and Lawrence, and his sister, Beatrice. The Caldwell family would be represented by Augustus, Penelope, Vivian the bride, and young Harrison. Also attending would be 2 particularly close associates of the Thornton family, Judge Cornelius Hampton and his wife Lydia, longtime friends who had been instrumental in protecting the Thornton family's interests whenever legal questions arose about their treatment of slaves or business practices. 13 lives that had either directly harmed innocents or enabled such harm through their silence and complicity. Margaret had designed a menu that would allow her to target each guest with precision. The meal would begin with chilled cucumber soup, garnished with fresh dill, a light and refreshing start that would contain only the mildest sedative properties, just enough to relax the guests and make them less likely to notice subtle off flavors in later courses. The second course would feature cold poached salmon with a lemon cream sauce, served alongside asparagus spears. This dish would carry the first significant dose of her compounds, carefully calibrated amounts of processed foxglove that would begin affecting heart rhythms without causing immediate, obvious symptoms. The main course represented Margaret's most complex work. She planned to serve roasted duck with a cherry reduction sauce, accompanied by rice pilaf, studded with almonds and dried fruits, glazed carrots, and green beans with shallots. Each component would be treated differently based on her careful observations of individual preferences. Edmund Thornton, she had learned, particularly enjoyed dark meat and rich sauces. His portion of duck would be selected from the fattiest parts of the bird, and his sauce would contain concentrated extracts of nightshade and jimson weed, compounds that would cause increasing neurological effects, beginning with confusion and progressing to hallucinations and eventual paralysis. Preston Thornton preferred white meat and ate sparingly, his portions always smaller than others. Margaret would compensate for this by increasing the concentration of compounds in his food, using preparations of pokeweed root that would cause severe gastrointestinal distress before affecting the heart. Constance Thornton ate like a bird, picking at her food with affected delicacy, but she never refused dessert. Margaret planned to reserve her most potent preparations for the final course, ensuring that even Constance's small appetite would deliver a fatal dose. The Thornton sons and daughter would receive graduated doses based on their ages and what Margaret considered their levels of complicity in their family's cruelties. Augustus Caldwell presented a particular challenge. Margaret felt no personal affection for the man who owned her, but she understood that his death might be investigated more thoroughly than others, given his position in the community. She decided he would receive a dose calculated to cause severe illness and possible death, but with enough ambiguity that it might be attributed to natural causes or the same mysterious contamination that affected everyone else. Penelope and Harrison would be spared the worst effects. Margaret had no particular grievance against them, and Harrison was still young enough that she considered him not fully culpable for the sins of his family. Judge Hampton and his wife represented what Margaret considered a special category of guilt. They had never personally harmed anyone at Oakmont, but the judge had spent decades using his legal authority to protect wealthy families from accountability, dismissing charges against planters who murdered slaves, ruling that enslaved people had no legal standing to testify against whites, interpreting laws in ways that systematically denied humanity to an entire race. For them, Margaret prepared compounds that would cause increasing respiratory distress, a sensation of slowly suffocating that seemed symbolically appropriate for people who had spent their lives choking justice itself. The preparation of these specialized dishes required careful planning and flawless execution. Margaret could not simply add her compounds at the last moment. Many required specific preparation methods to achieve the desired effects.
Foxglove leaves needed to be dried and powdered, then steeped in alcohol to extract the active cardiac glycosides before being reduced to a concentrated tincture. Nightshade berries required careful processing to isolate the atropine and scopolamine while removing other compounds that might cause immediate violent illness and raise suspicion. The mushrooms she had gathered needed to be dried, ground, and mixed with specific carriers that would disguise their earthy taste. Margaret had spent weeks perfecting these preparations in secret, working late at night in the summer kitchen after everyone else had gone to sleep, using equipment she carefully cleaned afterward to remove any trace of her activities. She stored her compounds in small vials hidden beneath loose floorboards in a corner of the kitchen that no one else had reason to access, each one labeled in her private code that would mean nothing to anyone who might accidentally discover them. She had tested her extraction methods, her dosage calculations, her timing estimates through months of careful observation and small-scale trials. Now, with the celebration only days away, Margaret began the final preparations that would appear entirely normal to anyone observing her work. She ordered special ingredients from Savannah markets, selecting the finest ducks from a supplier who raised them specifically for wealthy tables, choosing salmon brought up from the coast that very morning, obtaining exotic spices and the best quality cream and butter. She supervised her assistants as they began preparing components that could be made in advance, stocks and sauces that would form the base of various dishes, pastry for the dessert tarts she planned to serve, preserves and pickles that would accompany the main courses. Patients remarked that Margaret seemed more focused than usual, almost obsessively attentive to every detail. Margaret explained that this celebration was particularly important given the prominence of the Thornton family, that Penelope Caldwell had made clear her expectations were higher than for any previous event. This explanation satisfied patients, who redoubled her own efforts to ensure everything met Margaret's exacting standards. Dinah and Esther followed suit, none of them suspecting that their head cook was planning anything beyond an exceptionally impressive meal. Margaret also began making her own preparations for what would follow the celebration. She knew that once the deaths began, she would need to disappear quickly and completely. She had spent weeks planning an escape route that would take her away from Oakmont through terrain she had carefully studied during her nocturnal plant-gathering expeditions. She had hidden small caches of food and supplies along this route, buried in waterproof wrappings at locations she had memorized. She had obtained a knife from Isaiah's forge, telling him she needed it for kitchen work, and had hidden it with her travel supplies. She had even prepared a change of clothing, plain and nondescript, that would allow her to travel without immediately being identified as a runaway slave. The question of what would happen to Isaiah troubled her more than she wanted to admit. She knew that he would be questioned extensively after her disappearance, that he might face punishment for her actions despite having no knowledge of her plans. She considered telling him something, giving him some warning that would allow him to protect himself, but she ultimately decided against it. Isaiah's genuine ignorance would be his best protection. If he truly knew nothing, his reactions to the deaths and her flight would be authentic, beyond suspicion. It was a calculated calculation, but Margaret had grown accustomed to making such calculations. Sentiment was a luxury she could no longer afford. On the evening of August 12th, 2 days before the celebration, Margaret sat in her cabin writing a final letter that she planned to leave hidden in a location where it might eventually be found, though not immediately. She wanted there to be a record of why she had done what she was about to do, a testimony that would survive even if she did not. She wrote about Grace, Benjamin, and Ruth, about their murders and the complete lack of justice that followed. She wrote about Edmund Thornton's cruelty and Augustus Caldwell's complicity. She wrote about a system so fundamentally corrupt that it considered the deliberate drowning of 3 children an acceptable price for maintaining good relations between wealthy families. She signed this letter, Margaret Whitfield. The name she had chosen for herself, the identity she would carry forward into whatever future awaited her beyond Oakmont. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.